Good morning and welcome to Mitcham Hills. It looks like spring has finally sprung. Beautiful day today, and we're about to hear Cullen this morning. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Cullen. It's a wonderful privilege to be able to share with you this morning, and thanks to the worship team. It was just a really wonderful time of worship, so thank you so much for that. I want to start with a quick story. When I got my first job, I was a courier. My mum worked at a printing place, and I did my first day's work as a courier, and I got given $50 by the boss. And I had that $50 in my back pocket, and I went to, I can't remember whether it was the City or Marion, and I was just walking sort of down one of the halls, and I met this really nice guy. And he started talking to me, and we struck up a really conversation. He was just a lovely guy, and he asked me these questions, and we started conversing. And before I knew it, we were talking about South American rainforests. And he pulled out this brochure, and he showed me all these pictures, and he was wonderful. We had this great conversation. And within a pretty short space of time, I'd given him the $50 out of my pocket, and I'd signed up for a weekly $50 for the next, I don't know, however long. He was a lovely guy. And I got home, and I think I said to my mum or dad, I sort of explained what had happened, and Mum kind of looked at me like, sometimes she looks at my father, what are you thinking? What were you thinking, you know? I said, he's a really nice guy. On that particular day, that particular gentleman demonstrated a very strong ability to take me from one place to another and get me to sign up to something really quickly. And he used all the tricks of the trade looking back on it. As a naive 17-year-old, I didn't realise, but he asked me the right questions, and he kept me warm all the time, and he led me through a process, and before I know it, I was willingly signing... Stitched up, exactly. Don't pretend I'm the only one that's ever happened to. Don't pretend that. Well, today we are going to look at some words that Jesus gave, where he literally said to a bunch of people following him, he said the opposite to what that guy did to me on that particular day. He said, before you make this massive decision to follow me, before you take your next big step of faith, stop, pause, think about it, and sit down. He said, before you make a big decision to run headlong into this life of faith, you've got to stop, pause, and think about it. Now, notice that the marketing types and the sales types, and anyone that's done sales and marketing amongst us, know that you never give anyone too much time to think about it, do you? I mean, when it's 3 a.m. and you're watching, they're trying to sell you the steak knives, there's always a time limit, isn't there? You know, you've got to call within the next 23 minutes to get the deal, right? Because they don't want you to think about it too long. Well, what we're going to see today is that Jesus is the complete opposite of that. That in the scriptures we discover that far from trying to rush people into this life of faith, this deep life of faith, he actually says to a bunch of people, before you make this decision, I want you to stop and sit down. Now, we'll get into the text in a minute that we're going to look at, but this is just good advice generally, isn't it? I mean, before you make a big decision in life, before you make any kind of decision in life, it sometimes helps to think it through, doesn't it? I'm someone who tends to rush things. I tend to get a really clear idea in my mind of the incredible benefit that I'm going to get from some particular thing, and I just then go for it. We pick up a piece of furniture or something. Look, the instruction manual is really for if a few hours down the track things haven't quite turned out, you might then refer back to the instruction. Is anyone else like that? Does anyone else like to go for it? Yeah, okay, good. How many times in our lives do we look back and think, if only I just thought it through a little bit more? Before I rushed into that relationship, if only I'd sat down and thought about it. Before I rushed into that financial decision, if only I'd spent a little bit longer sitting down and thinking about it. If only before I responded in that way to that friend of mine or that person or that colleague, I'd just had a cup of tea and thought about it. So this advice from Jesus we have today is just good life advice. So if you're not a person who's signed up to the Christian faith, or you're not sure about all this stuff, it's just good advice in your life. But when it comes to these questions about whether you want to follow Jesus with the entirety of your being, there's this question before us, and this is good advice. So we're going to look at Luke chapter 14, and we're going to ask ourselves, what does this advice that Jesus gives us tell us about who God is and what we're meant to do? So we're going to read from Luke 14. There's 4 books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, that deal predominantly with the life of Jesus. And we're picking up in verse 25. And it says here, large crowds were travelling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." Notice this isn't read at too many weddings, is it? This one. It's not read at too many weddings, is it? In fact, some of you are reading this thinking there's a typo. There must be a mistake. Now, just to clear this up, go back one, sorry, Jax. Just to clear this up really quickly, obviously in the scriptures, Jesus talks about loving your mum and dad, doesn't he? And he talks about loving your neighbour as yourself. And he talks about loving your enemy. So love is such a strong thing. If you go back to the original Greek, this term hate, there's actually a bit of nuance here. So just hang with me for a sec, right? So think about the people in your life that you love more than anything. They might even be in this room, your family members, your closest friends, how much you love them. The very hard bit of information that Jesus transmits to us here is that the call to discipleship is to love God more than even that person. The hard reality is that we are called to love God at an even greater level than the people we love. And I know as you think about this, you think about how much you love your mum or your dad or your children or your best friend. You think about how much you love them. And there's this radical call that Jesus gives here to his people to say, you will love me so much. Your love for me will be so great, it will almost be like you hate those people who you absolutely love. Does that make sense? There's this difference here. It's never about obviously hating your mum or your dad at all. But it's this sense of you're going to love God so much more. And then he goes on into the next verse and says, "And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." So there's a huge crowd of people. They've all been interested in Jesus. They're following him around. They're watching what he's doing. And he turns to them and hits them with this stuff. Hits them with this. You've got to love me more than anything. And there's an element of sacrifice. You're going to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me if you want to be my disciple. The first thing, before we keep going into the text, the first thing we see here is that God tells it to us straight. Jesus here tells it to his people straight. You know, he's not like, as Yothi Indy said, these sort of talking politicians that tell the good side. I mean, can you imagine if one of the politicians got up and said, look, you could vote for us, but here's the downside. Maybe they would get lots of votes. Maybe they would. When you do your LinkedIn profile picture, do you do your best photo? Or do you do the photo when you're at your worst moment? When you're struggling and it's a bad day at work? No, of course not. You do your best photo. And you do it on the right or the left. I can't remember which side's my best, but my left or my right, And then and then of course you Photoshop. I mean, you Photoshop it, and because you want to look good. Point here is that Jesus isn't trying to spin us about what the life of discipleship is going to be, what a life of faith is going to be. He's being very upfront. He's putting the hard bit right before us. That's the first thing. Let's read on. So he tells it to us straight. And then he tells these 2 parables, okay? He says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. And then he tells another story and he says the same kind of thing. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. And then the next slide. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. So what do we see here about who God is? There's these 2 stories. And in both these stories that Jesus tells all these followers, he says, first sit down. First, sit down. So what does that tell us about God? Well, the first thing I think it tells us is that God seems to be interested in offering us two things: choice and space. Choice and space. Notice in this, Jesus isn't overbearing. He lays it out and he says to each of these individual people, go off and think about it. Isn't it incredible that the God of the universe, who put the stars into place, who then comes down to earth through the incarnation and becomes a human being and lives and dwells among us, and then dies on a cross for each one of us, gives us choice? He loves us so much. He loves every single individual person so much that he gives them the most incredible gift, which is free will and choice. Isn't that incredible? And he doesn't then seek to rush or to push or to overbear in the way that he shares who he is and what he asks. Isn't that incredible? And just a quick aside, I wonder what the implications are for us as people of faith in our communities and as a church within our community around the model that Jesus shows us here, where he unashamedly says what he believes, but then he gives people around him the gift of choice. It's an incredible thing. But the second thing he gives is space. He tells these two stories of these guys and says they sat down and they thought about it, they considered, they estimated. He gave them the gift of space. Many of us probably would love a bit of space. Would love, in this busy world that we find ourselves in, where there's lots going on and there's things happening and life's pulling us in different directions, we crave space, don't we? I mean, we crave, if you're in the school holidays, the ability to turn the phone off for a bit and think and just be present in the moment. And our wider culture is kind of accepting that we need to find ways to get away. We need to find ways to do yoga or be mindful or find ways to sort of separate ourselves out, because that's where we can do our best thinking. But it's also true, isn't it, that we find ways to cram the space that we have. I mean, if you're in the dentist's waiting to go in, you're sitting there in the chair, what do? What do most of us do? Pull the phone out when we flick through, you know. Geez, I really need to check those MBA scores. I mean, seriously, like what? I've got to be on top of that. We check our phone. I mean, we all do it. We find ways, inevitably, to cram the space we have. I mean, we've got no time, but we've managed to binge watch like half of Netflix. And Netflix is good, but we find ways as human beings to cram the space we have. And yet, in this model that we see here from Jesus, he's saying, before you enter into massive life decisions about whether you follow me, carve out some space. Carve out some space. Because when we carve out space, not only do we have time to think and to be present and to be mindful, but we start seeing things a little bit clearer. And you may have had a period of your life where space was forced on you, where you were forced to take time out, you were forced to have a break, you were forced to do the deeper thinking work. And you look back on that period and say, thank goodness that came. I didn't know it at the time, but it was so valuable to me because I was able to think, I was able to be in the moment. But when we have that space, we also start seeing ourselves a bit more for who we are. When we're running around and things are happening, it's hard to get a sense of who we are. But when we have that space, we can see ourselves more clearly. I don't know about you, but the times when I'm on my own, in the dark of night often, are the times when I start to go through some of the things I've done through the day, how I've responded in certain situations. Did I manipulate that situation for my own benefit? Did I talk to that person in the way I should? They're the times when you're on your own that you start to think and you start to see yourself for who you really are. The other thing that happens, I think, is that when we're sitting down, we become more awake to what's in front of us. A few months ago now, I was fast asleep and I woke up and there was a hand on my face. And I quickly worked out, even though I was half asleep, that this hand was too big and hairy to be the hand of either of my daughters or Merrin. And I pushed it away, you naturally just push it away. And then the hand hit me, like it actually hit me. And I pulled myself out of bed and said, Merrin, we're being attacked. And she sort of got up and I grabbed the hand And then I realised it was my own hand. And I'd slept funny on my We're going to cut this part out of the video. I'd slept funny on my arm.
I'm so glad we came to church.
Yeah, I'd slept funny on my arm. My arm had gone to sleep and had fallen on my... And it's not a prettier hand, I'll tell you. I mean, I have first-hand experience now. I mean, it was on my face and I pushed it off and it went back straight in my face. How does this relate, you wonder? When we're half asleep in life, we think that we're fine. We think that we're all okay. When we're awake, when we're fully awake, we realise that it's us getting in the way half the time. And we see ourselves for what we really are. When it comes to counting the cost and having that time and that space, I think God does some work in us where we get to see who we really are, that we are broken people, that we are not perfect, that we have all kinds of motives, and that our only answer ultimately is Him. So God told it to us straight in those first little bits. He gives us choice and He gives us space. But clearly here, He wants us to do some weighing up, doesn't He? This is clear here. What Jesus says here, He wants us to do this process of weighing up, of estimating. I wonder why that is. Why does He want us to do that thinking, that considering, that dwelling in that moment where you're trying to work it all out? Well, obviously, He tells the story of before you build a house, you've got to count the costs. Now, anyone that's built a house in the last 12 months, when you sit down and estimate the costs, you probably kind of need to add about 20% as it kind of goes up. This has been a challenging period. But it's good logical sense, isn't it? In terms of working out how much money you have and making sure you are able to afford what you're doing. But also, I think there's a value when you're thinking about building a house is you put in, you think about the variabilities that might occur and you put in some extra and redundancy and all those sorts of things so that you're prepared for when things go wrong, right? And I think there's a part of that when we're considering our big next step of faith, when we're thinking about going deeper as a disciple of Jesus, Jesus says, I don't want you to be fooled that this is going to be a walk in the park. I don't want you to think this is all beer and Skittles. I want you to think through up front the cost and the sacrifice, and I want you to weigh it up. And something happens to us when we're able to do that. I was at a funeral only a few weeks ago, and it was a funeral of an older man, and he had lived an incredible life, really. He was a very successful businessman. He was an incredible community leader. He was generous. He touched many, many people's lives. And he was one of those kind of larger-than-life characters that had helped everyone with a problem in the town that he lived in over at some point and had contributed here and there and everywhere. And he was an incredible man. And as the story of his life was told, and these incredible achievements were told, there was an aspect of his life that was honestly shared. And it was by his children. And his children shared that even though their father had been a great man and he'd achieved certain things in business and in the community and all those sorts of things, that they had never felt that their relationship with him had been damaged. There'd been a cost to him being a successful businessman and a successful community leader. And that they'd never had the time that they really wanted with their dad. And it was really clear on display in this funeral that there'd been a cost. That when you weighed it up at the end of this man's life, there were incredible things that he'd done, but there was a cost. And I do wonder a couple of things. I wonder whether if he'd sat down at the start of his life and weighed all that up, whether he would make the same decision. I don't know. But also there was this reality that's lived with me ever since, that you can't do everything in life. The world around us tells us we can do everything, we can be everything, we can kind of achieve here and we can do that, and even we can be a Christian and we can do boom. And Jesus here seems to say to us that in your sitting down and your dwelling and your estimating and your thinking and your consideration, realise that you can't do everything. And that there is going to be a cost and there is going to be a sacrifice. Last week we went away Merrin and the girls and I went away for a weekend, which was lovely. And this is a little confession. We intended to come back for church on Sunday morning. We were finishing up at Clayton, and we'd had a wonderful weekend, and we were trying to get out of the house, and we just couldn't get it. Like, it was just one of those things we just couldn't get done in time, and the time we had to leave, and we missed that, and all those. This sounds like I'm making an excuse for not coming to church. Mum, sorry. But we intended to come back to church, but we just, time didn't work, so we thought, well, we'll make the most of it. We went through Strathalbyn, and we had a coffee in Strathalbyn. Oh, it was a nice coffee. And we looked in some shops, and the girls played with the ducks. Oh, it was just and it was like this beautiful morning. Then we got home, and Merrin had to take the girls to something, so I put on the TV and watched Insiders, which is a bit of a political nerd program, which I like. And I thought to myself, this is the best Sunday morning I've had in a long time. This is just, I feel so relaxed. The sun's out, just for a moment. There's always a cost, isn't there? Even being a part of a worshipping Christian community and serving, there's a cost. And you might not think my ducks at Strathalbyn and Insiders is a worthy cost, but there'll be other costs for you. And there's always a sacrifice and a cost. And Jesus says, think about it, weigh it up before you make your decision. When we weigh it up, obviously Jesus in this bit tells us about the hard bits. But I don't know about you, but when I weigh anything up, you sort of do a kind of a line, you do the pros and the cons and the pluses and the minuses, and you weigh it up. And when we think about what a life of faith is, there are cons, of course. But there's also a lot of pros. And it's not just about, the old ticket to heaven at the end, that's not. It's about the kind of life that we can live in the here and now. It's about being under the lordship of a God who loves us deeply, who will be with us through every single moment, no matter how difficult. There's incredible pros and incredible cons as well, but he wants us to weigh those things up. But something else I think works within us when we're sitting down and considering. And my 10-year-old and I have been reading The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, which is a great book. And there's this scene in The Hobbit where little Bilbo Baggins, the little hobbit, the whole sort of plot story of the book is they're going to the Dragon's Mountain, Smaug's Mountain, to try and get the treasure back for the dwarves. That's the plot kind of summary. And there's this scene where Bilbo has to go down right into the dragon's lair. He's sort of been volunteered to go down into the dragon's lair, to go where none of the dwarves are brave enough to go. And this is what Tolkien writes. And he's in this little tunnel. Bilbo Baggins is this little tunnel, and he can smell and he can hear the dragon at the bottom of the tunnel. It says this: "It was at this point that Bilbo stopped. Going on from there was the bravest thing he ever did. The tremendous things that happened afterwards were as nothing compared to it. He fought the real battle in the tunnel alone, before he ever saw the vast danger that lay in wait. At any rate, after a short halt, go on, he did." Jesus asks us, each one of us, to consider him, to consider the cost, and to think about it, and then to make a decision about whether we want to step into a greater life of faith. He doesn't overimpose on us. He doesn't seek to manipulate or trick us into it. He gives us a free choice. He crafts out the space for us to think about it. And within each one of us, there is like this internal struggle that goes on as we approach that decision about whether we want to take that next step. And as Tolkien said in The Hobbit, sometimes that moment when we make a decision to go even deeper is more glorious than the moments of achievement that come later, if that makes sense. And for each and every one of us, this moment awaits. And it's not an emotional response necessarily. It's not a quick thing. It's something that we think about and that we have to consider and weigh up. Now, over the coming weeks in our church, we're going to be running through this series called Being, where we're going to be going deeper into this idea of what does it look like to be a person of faith, of deep faith. What does it look like for our community to live as disciples of Jesus, not just sort of distant followers, but disciples? And I want to ask each and every one of us to, at some point this week, sit down, as Jesus said. Think, consider, weigh up. And you might say, well, Cullen, I did that. I did that thinking back in the 70s, and I came to faith in the early 70s. Fantastic. The Bible talks about taking up our cross every day. There's always room for us to do this thinking, this weighing up, this estimating, this consideration, and making a decision to go even further into faith. So I want to encourage every one of us this week to craft out some space, to do that thinking, and decide whether you want to take that next step after a short halt and go deeper into a life of faith. Let's pray. Well, Father, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for his life. We thank you for his death and his resurrection, but we also thank you for his incredible advice that he gives us here. And I thank you that you are a God who allows people to choose. I thank you that your love for us is so great that you give us choice and you give us space. And I thank you for the way that you work inside us in ways we can't understand. That you are, even right now, working inside us, unlocking certain things within our hearts and within our souls that give us the ability to take that next step of faith. And I want to pray a really specific prayer for those amongst us who are really wrestling at the moment, wrestling with faith, wrestling with what it looks like to take that extra step, wrestling with the cost of following you. I want to pray that you would be with them, you would give them guidance, you would continue to give them space, that you would give them understanding and wisdom to make that next step. And I pray for all of us as we consider these deep things, that we would be able to look to you for guidance, that we would be able to look to each other for support, and that would ultimately be able to make the steps of faith that you call us to. And so we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
What a challenge. I hope you can find some time to carve out, make that decision to carve out time today and dwell on the message that Cullen gave us. We'll see you next week. Bye.